So I think there's quite a bit of time carved out for the meetup, and I do not have slides that are going to take that long. So certainly feel free to pop questions in the chat or save them to the end. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A and digging into the guts of stuff afterwards. But today I just want to give a really brief overview of what DBT is, why it's important, why now, like why did this not happen 10 years ago? The answer is the cloud. So DBT actually sprung out of a company called RJ Metrics, who to the cloud. RJ Metrics, who were doing a lot of work. They built an extraction tool that you might have heard of called Stitch, and so they built this data modeling tool to solve the problem that Stitch created all of these raw tables, but they were completely impractical for doing analytics work on top of. And so they started out making this little tool where you'd write a query to transform the data into a consistent format. And then when they left RJ Metrics to start their own consultancy, they took that tool with them and continued to develop it. And it really ballooned from there. So where DBT fits in on the modern data stack, which is to say all of the cloud-based things that are made possible nowadays, you've got at one end of your transformation diagram the ingestion from SaaS tools or from databases through tools like Fivetran, like Stitch, however else you get the data in, and then they go into a cloud data warehouse. So historically, we've supported Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, Databricks, Postgres, but over time, the community has also contributed. So there's like a ClickHouse adapter, and then there's other startups like Firebolt who are making their own connectors. There's about a dozen different adapters. Someone's built a Microsoft SQL Server adapter, so it's very extensible. And so once you get your data into your warehouse, you can build models, so you can transform your data in a consistent format. Then you can put tests around it, you can document it, and then you can deploy it out to production. So you've got a development environment and a staging environment and a production environment, which means that analysts can rely on the data they're using, while data engineers or analytics engineers, who sort of sit in the middle between those two posts, can do their work without worrying about impacting production use cases. And then at the far end of the channel, you've got your end users, your BI tools, your ML workloads. Reverse ETL is an interesting space that's coming up at the moment, where you take this nicely transformed data, all this normalized stuff, and push it back into HubSpot, Salesforce, Segment, whatever else you're using to really operationalize the data. And DBT's trick is that it just transforms the data using SQL. So there's not there's Ginger for templating. It's a templating language, but anything you can do in SQL, you can do with DBT, and it just makes it a lot easier and a lot more robust. So this really democratizes it, because if historically your ETL workloads were being built in Python by a handful of data engineers, that becomes a real bottleneck. If you can say, well, everyone speaks SQL, and you can open that up that much more, and people can take responsibility for if they need a change in their and the work and the data set they're querying from, then they can just do it. And we actually had this in our team the other week. Someone on our partnerships team who speaks SQL well enough, but that's sort of where they top out. They needed to add another couple of columns to a model that they were building in Looker, and they were able to hop in, see the lineage of the data, where it was coming from, and add those two columns, open a pull request against the internal analytics repo, and then our internal data team reviewed it, approved it, and pushed it out to production. And there was no bottlenecking of, sure, we'd love to give that to you, but we're really busy with this other stuff right now. Can you come back in a month, 6 months, a year? Never. And so that's been really powerful. So I used DBT in my past life. I was the head of data at a edtech startup in New Zealand. And we went straight from doing everything the exact wrong way, where we were just running queries against the production database that was also making the site go, to and having a god-awful messy homegrown reporting layer, to actually rolling out DBT and Redshift and Mode all in one go, which was actually really convenient, because I think doing it, like, you can migrate your work to the DBT lifestyle, and a lot of companies are doing that as part of their cloud transformation, but it's also a lot easier if you can just do it right from the start. So why now? So we've talked a little bit about the cloud. In the olden days, it was impractical to store your entire clickstream event data in Postgres or in SQL Server, because it would just fall over under load. And so you had to transform that down and do all of your aggregations in advance, and then write the final flattened data set into the tables for querying, which was fine, but it meant that, again, you were doing that all in Python probably, or you were doing it in a bespoke language, which I don't know because I came to this all quite late. But there was a lot more silos, and it was a lot harder to get stuff done compared to where we are now, where you can quite happily ingest everything into an elastic, infinitely scalable storage and compute warehouse. And then you just sort of have this abstract concept of a database, and it just does the work. And so that meant that there was more people who could write queries that we talked about with democratizing through SQL, and engineers could spend less time babysitting pipelines and more time optimizing the overall workloads. So how DBT works is the most important part is this ref function. And so what this does is it lets you build a DAG of dependencies. So a directed acyclic graph, I'm assuming people are familiar, especially if you're using Airflow or something, then it's like, this depends on this, and then so on down the chain. And so you can build these staging models to clear out your messy data. This is obviously very simplistic example, but then you can have orders that depend on staging orders, and that means that your analysts who are at the end of the funnel can actually use clean, known good data, which is documented and is keeping its own DAG up to date. So how we think about this is that everyone should use SQL, and everyone should work like engineers. So they should have modularity, there should be testing, there should be continuous integration, continuous deployment, you should document your work. And none of this is new. It's how software has been built for ages. It's just that it's somewhat of a new concept for the data world, where a lot of data work is just a random SQL file stored on one person's desktop, and it's called like board numbers to final fixed.sql. So we like this. Turns out a lot of other people like this. There's some 8,000 companies using DBT since it came out in 2016 or so. To the moon, yep, that is dead right. And we've got some big logos. The good folk at HubSpot use DBT. JetBlue actually uses DBT, so the airline uses it to work out for their real-time analytics. So is there, how long until the gates shut? Is there time to add another bag? And they do that with just straight SQL and some very clever stuff that our professional services team help them out with. And there's some like 25,000 people in the Slack community, and that means that anything that you're coming across, you're probably not the first person to. And so there's a real, DBT itself is not that special. The marketing team will yell at me for saying that, but like any sufficiently motivated engineer could build something like this in a few weeks, and many have, and many of them have abandoned it in turn because homegrown tools languish over time. You build it once, and then it's a perfect representation of what you need to do your work today. And then 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line, stuff's changed. It's like, yeah, but I've got other stuff to do. And I know this because before I was head of data, I was in charge of our internal systems and managed our homegrown CRM, and it was a disaster, and I did not like it. we bought HubSpot. It's really good. Starting to develop a Ginger. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like it's Ginger and SQL. It's like, oh, how hard could it be? And the answer is not that hard. Like, but it's everything else around it, and it's the standardization on DBT as a transformation layer and as a way of thinking has been really important to all of this. So how does it work? We sort of talked in this a few ways, but the most important part is easier to do it the right way, hard to do it the wrong way, making hard things easy, or easy things easy and hard things possible. And so you've got you build your models, you document them, you test them, you deploy them. So we talked about everything is just select statements. So there's, I think the historic way of doing this was a lot of stored procs. It was you sort of had this Jenga tower of the first stored proc would run and it would create a table and insert it and then delete stuff and then it would update stuff and you'd go on down the line. DBT, everything is a select statement, and you can issue custom hard delete stuff in like a post hook of like when the job ends, delete these rows, but that's not like DBtonic. Like there's Pythonic code, there's DBtonic code, and in DBT world, everything is a select statement, which means that everything can be idempotent. So you run it once, twice, a million times, you get the same results, and you don't have to worry about state. So DBT core is totally stateless. There's DBT Cloud, which is built on top of that. That's our software as a service offering, which is how we monetize this. But core, I mean, there was 8,000 core users, and about 1,000 of them are using cloud. So there's a very significant open source uptake. And so you say, oh, well, if everything's a select statement, then that sounds like it would be not that efficient. And no, it turns out. At first, everything's a view. Once you have things that are a little bit too slow for that, you can convert them to a table. And so that means you bake in the transformation and it'll be updated on whatever cadence you're doing. If that gets too slow, then you can change to an incremental model where you only load in data that's changed since the last run. And all of these things, you're trading off complexity for performance. But out of the box, you can do a lot of stuff and you don't really need to worry too much about. So DBT takes responsibility for writing all of your DDL and all your DML, which again means that there are more people who can get involved in this. They don't have to think as hard about how does this all come together? How do I make sure that stuff runs and that I don't have dependencies that don't exist yet? So run order, the correct schema is worked out for you. So there's these two. So I talked a little bit about environments at the start. So you've got the same model code up the top here, but when you run it, depending on which schema or which environment you're pointing at, it'll put it into your dev schema or your prod schema, which is really nice because it means that when you've got end users querying that, you can still be messing around with stuff for another project and not interfere with production use cases. So macros are the same sort of thing you'd expect of like abstracting away snippets of fiddly code into reusable stuff. You can actually do introspective queries. So one of my favorites is there's a DBT utils package, which just is a bit of a mixed bag of everything to make your life easier. And one of them is, I don't know if anyone's used BigQuery, but it has like a select star accept. And so you can drop off the one column that you don't want. That is wonderful, but it's only available if you use BigQuery. DBT can get that by dropping down to the information schema, looking at which columns are in that table, and then pulling out just the ones you want. And there's all these sort of things like that, which are not, again, like none of this is hard to do on your own if you want to, but when you're scaling out to dozens or hundreds of analytics engineers, or you just want to use the same stuff in multiple different places, it's really nice. And then you can take that a layer further and say, well, okay, but everyone has to normalize Fivetrans data that comes in from NetSuite or wherever. And so we have a package manager built in where there's two different types of packages. I've mentioned DBT utils, which is like macros and tests and making your life easier. There's also things like Fivetran in particular are a really strong contributor on this, where they have built like, I don't know, 30 different packages to normalize the input data from all of the different connectors. There's people who build like DBT, ML pre-processing. So they've taken a lot of the stuff out of, I want to say it's like scikit-learn. Like they take a lot of those macros and have ported them to SQL. There's someone who's done a SQL port of Great Expectations. And all of those things mean that you get to spend time focusing on your unique business logic. You don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. So that's the development. Documentation, we've talked about refs. So you get your dependency management, you get your DAG. This is what a DAG looks like. So these green ones are sources. These blue ones are different staging layers, marts, and then they all roll up into exposures, which are how does all of this actually come together to drive business value. And so one of the things that we shipped last year was you can take one of these exposures, one of these, like, how is this data expressed out to the rest of the business? And you can create an iframe which will look at the source freshness and the tests that are attached to all of these models to say, this data is up to date and all of the tests are passing, you can trust this dashboard. And it also means that if that's not true, then your finance team can see that before they pull the numbers out for a board doc. They don't have to message you and say, hey, I've just spent all day on this and it's starting to not check out. And so it really does a lot to contribute to like the feeling of that the data team are on top of their stuff and they know what's going on. Like, again, like observability and software engineering is nothing new, but it's new in a data context in many ways. So testing, these probably should have been the other way around. Testing, you got generic tests, which can be written like this sort of thing, where you define the general concept of is something positive, and then you can, this can be changed to be any model. So you've got unique or not null, you've got accepted values, all of these are built-in tests. But you can also do relationships. You can do, like I said, there's a full port or largely full port of Great Expectations. There are dozens of different things that can be either hyper-specific of validate this one thing in my one table through to I want this test on pretty much every table I touch. And then when it comes to deployment, you've got CI, CD. Again, this looks at our cloud product, but you can do anything. Like you can do it with GitHub Actions, or you can do it with Jenkins, or whatever you're using for CI. You can run these same commands, and DBT, being environment aware, can do all of this work. And we're also, I talked about how everything is stateless. You can opt into being stateful. And so then you can say, well, I don't need to rebuild my entire DAG if I've changed one model. And we can just say, okay, we'll just run anything that's changed since the last production run. And so that sped up, like at my old job, that sped up our CI runs by like 10 times. That's it. So that's the short version. We've got a bunch of time. I'm hoping you've got a bunch of questions.
Yeah, could you maybe talk about what an onboarding journey is for a team that wants to like adopt DBT?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the lazy answer is it depends. The better answer is that you probably already have something that you probably got a goal in mind. Like, it's uncommon for people to just say, today I've woken up and I'm going to revolutionize our data transformation framework. Like, there's probably a pain point in mind. And so maybe that is testing, maybe that's reproducibility, maybe that's observability, maybe it's just we have no idea how any of this works, but it seems to work. And so I would go for like an MVP of like a wide slice as opposed to so like I'd pick one. If you've got everything defined in Airflow at the moment, maybe pick like one strand of the DAG that runs from end to end. So from one source data, one or two source tables, through to their transformations, their staging layers to pull out the deleted stuff, tidy up that one like testing account that the QA team uses, and then get that out to the other end. And then you can actually use, there's another package that's for auditing, where you can actually validate that you're getting the same results from the old table and the new table. And then once that's built out and you've got tests on it and you've got confidence that it works, then you can promote that and you can continue to eat away at the elephant over time. It doesn't have to be a wholesale like lift and shift in one go, because DBT, just speaking SQL, means that the rest of your data stack doesn't have to know it exists, because all it knows is that, hey, there's a table there and I expected that table to be there and it's still the same shape. Your tables are your interfaces, are your public commitments to other consumers, and as long as they stay the same shape, then who cares how they get made?
So almost follow-up question on the social side of that. How do you get the analysts on board? Because in the short term, doing all of this means that the analytics workflow is slower, at least at first. Long term, I think it definitely goes faster, but asking data analysts who may not have prior engineering experience to, start doing CI/CD, start doing a Git workflow, it does add time, especially as they're getting up to speed. What methods have you found effective in jumpstarting that process?
Yeah, for sure. And that was me. So I had done a little bit of back-end engineering. I wound up learning C# because I had to. But I could only do that in, like, if somebody gave me a laptop that was all set up and Visual Studio was installed and all the configs were done, then I could write code all day and did a half decent job of it. But if I'd had to set up a project from scratch, then I would have been totally hosed. And the same thing actually held true for DBT, where I have learned a lot more of the command line stuff over the last 2 years or so, just from there's really good progressive disclosure of complexity of you can start with you just add a unique test on your model, and then you say, okay, well, what is a test? And it turns out that it's just basically a macro. And then you're like, okay, well, then I could probably make my own, and you can layer up on top of that. But right at the start, this is actually where the DBT Cloud ships with a IDE, so that you can do all of this in browser. You can write all of your code, and it all, because it's just going back and forth with Git, then it doesn't actually need to be, again, no one needs to know whether you're developing on the CLI or whether you're developing in the web browser, or you're doing it with Vim, like a distressingly large proportion of my colleagues do at DBT Labs. They're weird, but I love them anyway. And that really made it a lot easier of there's a very cut down Git workflow of commit your stuff and then go, and GitHub's pretty friendly in terms of going through the pull request flow. Again, if I had to do Git on the command line, it would suck, but that's why we have GUIs. And so that is my answer, is that's how I did it, was really leveraged the fact that it was out of the box. I didn't have probably 9 months in, then I was like, okay, well, I should try and do this on the CLI as well. And it's sort of like a graduation day of, now I can also do this at the command line. I'm a real hacker. But the discovery, and on that note, at our user conference last year, Coalesce, we teased shipping in later this year that we're going to be making it possible for people to use a local editor like VS Code or whatever in conjunction with a thin client, a thin server that will ship your queries and your work off to DBT Cloud, so that you can work locally, but you don't have to worry about installing Python so DBT core itself is a Python package, and you don't have to worry about virtual environments or anything else. You just install it however we're going to do that, but it'll have no dependencies itself per se. It'll just magically work, and then you can use your pre-configured access that's on DBT Cloud to interact, which means that you don't have to worry about VPNs, and you don't have to worry about changing versions of Ginger. And oh my God, Python's the worst, but
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
And DBT.
Can you? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Can you use Bitbucket? We have a client that uses that exclusively. Is it just the same as connecting it with Git?
Yeah. So Bitbucket, I can't remember the specific, like anything that speaks Git, you can manage your repo. And I think potentially we don't support Bitbucket on cloud yet. I think it's GitLab and GitHub. I'd have to look into that, but you can certainly, if you're doing it on the command line, then you can do anything because it's just files on the file system.
Gotcha.
I was going to ask, DBT core is open source, yeah?
I'll call that.
Well,
yes. I can say more about. I thought that might have been like the build up for a longer question, but yeah. So DBT core is open source. We went to version 1.0 at the end of last year, and so that means that we've locked in these interfaces. This is the stable version that people can feel comfortable really getting stuck into with, and it's a little bit of a I don't know, like it's not like an entirely a branding exercise, but it's sort of like us putting our stake in the ground and saying like, this is how you will work with DBT for the next 2 years. I don't know, how long will it take us to ship version 2? Probably a couple of years. And so you can start really relying on this. Whereas we were shipping a new minor version in the version 0 days every 12 weeks or so, and they would have significant breaking changes for especially people building on top of DBT. So if you were just using like a vanilla installation, then you'd be pretty fine. But there was a lot of people who were building CLI tools on top of DBT. Like there's someone who's built a really cool fuzzy search autocompleter for the CLI, which looks at the artifacts of your DBT run to be able to make a whole lot of things more streamlined. And those artifacts were changing every 12 weeks, which is impractical. So now we're like, well, these are locked in. They might be added to, but they'll be backwards compatible. You can rely on them, and you can really get stuck in. And all of that happens in public. We've got a very robust GitHub repo where our core, like the DBT core PM is a force of nature. He writes the most phenomenal responses to issues I've ever seen in an open source project. It's incredible. And somehow has like all 4,000 tickets in his, it's weird, but it's a very, very, very friendly, very actively engaged open source project, and we really do a lot of work on the community being involved as partners in the process.
Yeah, how's the Slack channel? Looks pretty big. So
It's organized chaos is what I'd say. So that is part of my gig on the developer experience sits under the community team, basically as what we're saying is the technical connective tissue between the community at large and the product team and the engineering team and the rest of DBT Labs. And so a decent chunk of my day is hanging out on the Slack, seeing where people get stuck and feeding that back to either issues on the core repo or documentation changes, or if it's on the cloud, then going and advocating for that internally. And then there's also like there's a very strong pay it forward culture of like that people are in there to share their knowledge and to help other people work out how to do this all together. And when the Slack first got spun up, 2016, 17, somewhere like that, there was like 50 people in it, and they were all working out together, like not just how does DBT work, but like how does analytics engineering work? Like how do you solve these problems? Because there was not really there was no way for analysts to talk shop. And so that's where it grew out of. And there's now one of the big things that the community team, we're about 7 people. We're going to probably double this year alongside the rest of the company in terms of headcount. And we are thinking a lot about how do we simultaneously empower like new DBT users to come in and get a good experience while also not just being like Stack Overflow, but with emoji. And that is not easy, but it's important to be able to both have the quick, hey, I'm trying to do this and I've never done it before and I don't know how. Can someone give me a hand? But also like higher order discussions about like what does it mean to hire a high-performing analytics team?
And I have a sort of follow-up question for groups that have, analysts and engineers separate in terms of, and this is specifically within the context of DBT Cloud. How do you balance, sort of having like core data pipelines defined in DBT that, we want some friction around changing because we want to make sure that analysts can't accidentally break anything in production and cause the CEO to see bad numbers, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. How do we balance that with giving analysts the tools to self-serve and start building new data models, just like from a sort of like process and project perspective?
Again, it depends. To an extent, it depends on the size of your project. What some very large companies do is they'll have like multiple DBT projects, and their like core stuff will be itself a DBT package that's emitted to other downstream consumers. And that sort of frees things up that has trade-offs. I think I, as a rule, am team monorepo, but you can do it either way. And there's a big write-up on the discourse that I'll track down and link in a second. But you can have it set up that you've got like your core tables and your core artifacts that are defined and then they're consumed downstream. But also talking about like how do we let people get in and mess around without screwing up the CEO's dashboard. That's where environments come back into play, where each person gets their own schema. So their own schema to mess around in. So we have like the main analytics schema and all of the things, all the sub schema that come out of that. But we've also got, I have a dev JLabs schema where all of my experimentation happens, and then when I'm ready for it to go back into the main branch, then I open a PR, it gets reviewed, and it also goes through CI to check that I haven't broken any of the expectations. And so it's probably a combination of documentation, of strong environment management, and optionally extra for experts, pulling chunks of that out and just having it be, this is a black box. You can go and read its docs, but you're not actually empowered to edit it, depending on how enthusiastically you want to enforce those boundaries.
Gotcha. So that dev environment becomes really important there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Makes sense.
It's a long article, but that's talking about one project or many projects and the different trade-offs that come from that.
Thank you.
Sure.
No more questions.
Well,
survey. Oh, you have a question?
Oh, I was going to say, if no one else has any questions, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about best practices around materialization and how you'd recommend doing that in DBT.
Yeah, for sure. The short version is views until that doesn't work, tables until that doesn't work, incrementals, and then after that, there's a very interesting presentation from Coalesce last year by Vinci from Canva, who are like the biggest tech company out of Australia since Atlassian. And they have just phenomenal volumes of clickstream data happening. And they did some very interesting things with, like I think they rewrote the incremental materialization to fit on their usage patterns. So that's actually one of the we've talked a bit about how DBT is extensible right down to the bones of like every materialization you can re-implement, because all of it is just DBT macros. Like it's all just SQL generators on top of SQL generators. And so they sort of took I'll find that link as well, but they went on a journey of, we started out as just the standard one, then we tried to do this other little hack that made it like incrementally better, and then that fell over. And so it's running to stay ahead of your data volumes. But in broad strokes, if your warehouse can handle it, then DBT can handle it, because DBT is just asking your warehouse to do the work. And so there is a point where you're like, well, okay, but this is very, very expensive, and then you need to worry about optimization. But it's not like you have to understand the intricacies of query planning and optimization to get out of the gate. You can sort of come to that when you need it. Did you have a specific use case in mind?
Well, so there I'm wondering like how you actually execute that as a DBT model in terms of it then staying updated. Do you just like execute the data model once with the materialized view or incremental view, and then let the actual warehouse transformation engine keep that up to date? Or
so in terms of keeping stuff up to date, the standard incremental materialization is you write basically two versions of your query. One that is starting from scratch when the table doesn't exist, and that there's a second macro that's called like is incremental, and that returns false if it's a brand new build. And in that case, it'll just fill everything from scratch. And then when you have a variant of that query, which is doing things like where the created data is greater than the max of the current table. And so that'll backfill your stuff. And that assumes either it's append only or you've got a modified date so that you can detect changes. If you don't have either of those, and there is stuff back in time that needs to be detected and revisited, then you can do a full refresh, and you can just drop the table and rebuild it. Maybe you do that once a week in the middle of the night when no one's going to notice, or you can do other things. Like if you can work out a way to describe the rows you're looking for to your source table, then you can do that in DBT. Otherwise, this is where you're sort of walking off the idempotent DBtonic way of doing it, but you can do like just a post hook of delete these records that are bad in some way if you as your escape hatch. But I don't like doing that.
Gotcha. So effectively, it is actually like incremental, not materialized per se. So you just every time you're only updating the appropriate rows.
Yeah, I guess materialization is maybe becoming an overloaded term, where there's like materialized views, which are all the goodness of views and all the goodness of tables all in one. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about DBT has the concept of a materialization, which is like, what sort of object is this creating in your database, and how does it do it? So there's 4 that are built in of views, tables, ephemerals, which are not actually persisted to the database. They're just a CTE that gets inlined just in time. And that can be helpful if you want to do some like some low, you want to like abstract something out to pull out into like its own function or its own method in a object-oriented view, but you don't want a paradigm, but you don't want it to actually appear in your lineage or anything. And then incremental materializations are, they wind up as tables that insert new records based on what we were talking about before. But then our professional services team, I saw someone last week who was building their own materialization to pull data in from, I think, a Google Sheet, or like, I think BigQuery has some sort of native Sheets integration. And so they were building a materialization that built those commands to import the Google Sheet data directly. So it can be up to interacting with other web services.
Cool, thank you. Bancho, I think you were going to say something before I asked my question.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say I dropped the survey link in the chat, so let's fill out the survey if any feedback or for the meetup, or if you want to be a speaker.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. It was nice to meet everyone.